My dad stole my college scholarship money and threatened to kill himself because I was angry. I said, go ahead. All right, so here's how it all started. I'm in my first year of college, right? Feeling like I've made it. Like I'm on track to get my life together and do something decent. I worked hard as hell in high school, got a full ride scholarship to this university, and even had my housing covered. It felt like a dream, you know? Except that dream went up in flames because of my dad. So, to give you some background, I come from a pretty messed up family situation. My dad? Well, he's been unemployed for as long as I can remember. Literally decades. He's always working on something or waiting for the right opportunity. But the truth is, he just doesn't feel like working. My mom's not much better, but we'll get into that later. Right now, it's all about what he did to screw me over. I get this check every semester for about $9,000 to cover my dorm fees. It's all part of my scholarship package, and it's supposed to go toward my housing. I never even see the money because it gets sent straight to my home address, where I don't live anymore. I didn't really think much of it because my dad told me he'd handle it. I was naive, like really naive. I guess part of me wanted to believe he'd step up for once, you know? Well, I should have known better. So about a couple months into the semester, I get this email from my college saying my dorm fees still haven't been paid. I'm confused, obviously, because I thought my dad had already taken care of it. I'm stressing out, thinking it's some sort of clerical error, and I start trying to figure out what's going on. I call my dad and ask him what's up with the housing payment. He gives me some runaround story about funds being hard to access, which honestly didn't make any sense to me. But at the time, I didn't know much about how all this financial stuff worked, so I let it go. Stupid, I know. Weeks go by, and I'm still getting these warning emails from the housing office. If the payment doesn't get made soon, I could get kicked out of my dorm. I'm barely sleeping, barely eating, just straight up anxious 24/7. All I could think was, what if I lose my spot in college over this? I worked so hard to get here, and it felt like it was slipping out of my hands all because my dad couldn't get his act together. Finally, I call him again, more desperate this time. I'm practically begging him to pay off my dorm fees before I get kicked out. That's when he drops the bomb on me. He used the $9,000 for the hotel. I'm like, what hotel? And then it hits me. You see, my dad, my mom, and my younger siblings had been living in a hotel for the past few months because they got evicted from our old house. I didn't think much of it before because, frankly, I had my own stuff going on with school and everything. But now, it all made sense. My dad had taken my scholarship money, money meant to pay for my housing, and used it to pay for the hotel they were staying in. He didn't even tell me. At this point, I'm fuming. I asked him why he didn't tell me earlier, and his excuse was that he didn't want to stress me out. Like what? You think I'm not already stressed out knowing that I could lose my spot at college because you couldn't pay the bill? I told him I worked my ass off in high school to get here and that it wasn't fair he was risking my education for his own mistakes. And you know what he said? He blamed me. He said it was my fault because I wasn't helping the family enough. Can you believe that? He even had the nerve to say that he was providing for the family by using my scholarship check. Like, dude, you've been unemployed for over 20 years. How is this providing for anyone? And then, to top it all off, he gave me this half-assed apology, like he was doing me a favor. I asked him, flat out, if he was sorry for what he did, and he said sorry, but in this sarcastic, mocking tone that made it clear he didn't mean it at all. I lost it. I told him he was full of crap and that he'd ruined everything. That's when he pulled his usual stunt, threatening to kill himself. Now, I'm not trying to sound cold, but this wasn't the first time he'd done this. Anytime I push back on anything, he pulls the I'm gonna kill myself card to make me feel guilty. Normally, I'd back down and apologize just to keep the peace, but not this time. I was too angry. I told him straight up to go ahead and do it. And then I hung up. After that, I felt a weird mix of guilt and relief. Like, I didn't want to be that harsh, but at the same time, I couldn't take the manipulation anymore. The man had stolen my scholarship money and then turned it around to make me feel like the bad guy. I wasn't going to let him guilt trip me into apologizing for being upset. Later that day, my mom called me, and of course, she was siding with him. She said I needed to apologize to my dad, that I was being disrespectful, and that I should have understood his situation. I was like, what situation? He stole my money and lied to me about it. But she kept pushing, telling me that if I didn't apologize, she'd cut me off from the family. At that point, I was exhausted. I hadn't been eating or sleeping well, I was behind in my schoolwork, and now I had my mom threatening to disown me. So I did what I always do in these situations. I backed down. I told her I'd apologize just to keep the peace, but deep down, I wasn't sorry at all. The whole situation had me questioning everything. Like, how did I end up in a position where I had to apologize for being angry that my dad stole from me? It felt so twisted. But that's just how things were in my family. My dad was always the victim, and my mom was always there to back him up no matter how bad things got. Anyway, that's where things stood. I was stuck, my housing still wasn't paid for, and I was left trying to figure out what to do next. The only thing I knew for sure was that I couldn't trust my dad with anything anymore. But even then, I couldn't fully break away. Not yet. So after that mess with my dad using my scholarship money, things were tense as hell between us. I was still at school, trying to keep up with my classes, but it was hard. I mean, how could I focus when I didn't even know if I'd have a place to live in a few weeks? Every day I was getting more and more emails from the housing office, and I kept having to make excuses about why the payment hadn't gone through yet. All the while, my dad is over here acting like he's done nothing wrong. He kept promising that he'd get the money together, saying he was working on it, and that I needed to stop worrying. But how could I not worry? The deadline was creeping up fast, and I couldn't just sit around hoping he'd magically come through. Thanksgiving break was coming up, and I was dreading going back home. I didn't even want to see my dad after everything that had happened, but I didn't really have a choice. It was either go home or stay in the dorms alone, and honestly, I didn't want to spend the holiday by myself. I figured I'd just go home, keep my head down, and avoid any big arguments. When I got there, things were super awkward right away. My dad was pretending like nothing had happened, trying to act all friendly, but I wasn't having it. I could feel this weird tension between us, like we were both waiting for the other one to snap. My mom, on the other hand, was doing her usual thing of playing peacekeeper, trying to brush everything under the rug. She kept telling me, "Just let it go. It's Thanksgiving. Don't start anything." But I was still pissed. At dinner, we all sat around the table, and I could barely eat. Every bite felt heavy, like I was swallowing a rock. My dad kept trying to make small talk, asking me about school and how my classes were going, like he actually cared. I gave short answers, trying to just get through the meal without blowing up. But then he brought up the scholarship money, and that's when I lost it. He casually mentioned how he'd figured it all out and would have the money by the weekend. I couldn't help it. I laughed, like really laughed, because I'd heard that line so many times by now that it was almost funny. Almost. "Sure, you'll have it by the weekend," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Just like you've had it for the last 2 months, right?" My dad's face dropped, and he got defensive immediately. He started going on about how hard things had been for the family, how I didn't understand the pressure he was under. The same crap he always pulled, but I wasn't going to let him guilt trip me again. "You stole my money," I shot back, trying to keep my voice steady, but it was hard. "That was for my dorm, and you spent it on yourself. Now I'm the one who's going to get kicked out because of you." He didn't like that. He started raising his voice, saying how he did what he had to do for the family, and that I should be grateful for everything he's done. Grateful? For what? For lying to me? For stealing from me? My mom jumped in, trying to calm things down, but it was too late. I couldn't hold back anymore. "You're always doing this," I shouted, standing up from the table. "You take, and then make it everyone else's problem when you screw up. I'm done, Dad. I'm done covering for you." He sat there, stunned for a second, but then he did what he always does. He turned it back on me. "You're being ungrateful," he said, shaking his head like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "I've sacrificed so much for this family, and this is how you repay me? By throwing it in my face?" I couldn't even look at him anymore. I was so angry that my whole body was shaking. I turned to my mom, hoping she'd at least back me up, but she just gave me this tired look, like she was disappointed in me for causing a scene. "You need to apologize to your father," she said quietly, like she was talking to a little kid. "He's doing his best." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Apologize? To him? After everything? "No," I said, my voice low but firm. "I'm not apologizing. Not this time." And with that, I walked away from the table, grabbed my coat, and left the house. I didn't even know where I was going. I just needed to get out of there. I walked around the block a few times, trying to cool down, but the anger wouldn't leave. It just kept building up inside me, like this weight I couldn't shake. After a while, I headed back to the house because, honestly, I didn't have anywhere else to go. When I got inside, the table was cleared, and my parents were sitting in the living room, not saying a word. I went straight to my room and shut the door, trying to block out everything. Later that night, my dad came into my room. He didn't knock, just walked in like he always does. He stood there for a moment, looking at me like he was about to say something important, but then he didn't. Instead, he started in with the same line he'd been using for months. "I'll have the money by Saturday," he said, his voice soft like he was trying to make peace. "You just have to trust me." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I was too tired. Mentally, physically, emotionally. I just nodded, knowing full well that I didn't believe a word he was saying. After he left, I laid there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, feeling this overwhelming sense of defeat. I'd spent so long trying to fix everything, trying to keep the peace and hold my family together, but it felt like no matter what I did, it wasn't enough. They always found a way to make me feel like the bad guy, like I was the one who needed to apologize. But I was done. Done apologizing, done pretending like everything was fine when it wasn't. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, constantly walking on eggshells around my parents, hoping they'd change when deep down, I knew they wouldn't. That was the moment it hit me. Nothing was going to change unless I made it change. I didn't know exactly how I was going to do it yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep going down the same road anymore. Something had to give, and for the first time in a long time, I realized it was going to have to be me. So, after Thanksgiving, I went back to school, and honestly, I was just trying to keep my head down. I didn't really talk to my parents much after that fight during dinner. Things were awkward, to say the least. My dad still hadn't paid the housing fees, and I kept getting those emails from the housing office. The deadline was way past, and I was still holding on to this slim hope that he'd actually come through like he said he would. But deep down, I knew better. The last straw came a couple weeks later when I got a notice saying if my dorm fees weren't paid by the end of the week, I'd be forced to leave. That was it. The panic really set in then. I was barely hanging on in my classes, and now I had this cloud hanging over me, wondering if I'd be homeless on top of everything else. I didn't know what to do. Like, what was I supposed to do? I'd already asked my dad 100 times, and I knew he'd just keep making excuses. I tried calling him again, one last time, just to give him a chance. But of course, it was the same old story. He claimed the money was coming soon, maybe by the weekend, maybe early next week. I could tell by his voice that he didn't have it, and he wasn't going to have it. He kept throwing around excuses like, "It's harder than you think," and "I'm doing my best." But honestly, I was sick of hearing it. I didn't even bother arguing anymore. I just hung up and sat there staring at the wall, trying to figure out what my next move was. That's when I realized I couldn't keep waiting around for him to fix things. He wasn't going to. He never had. I was on my own. I had to figure this out myself, or risk losing everything I'd worked for. I had no idea where to start, but the first thing that popped into my head was talking to the financial aid office at my school. Maybe they could help me out, give me a loan or something to cover the housing until I could figure out what to do next. It felt like a long shot, but I didn't have any other options. So I made an appointment and explained everything to the financial aid officer. I told them about how my dad had taken my scholarship check and spent it on something else, leaving me with nothing to pay for my dorm. The woman I spoke to was really understanding, but I could tell even she was struggling to figure out how to help me. She said something about emergency bursaries, but the amount wouldn't cover the full cost, and there were no guarantees. She also asked if I'd thought about reporting what my dad had done since, technically, he had committed fraud. She didn't say it outright, but I could tell she thought I should turn him in. And honestly, a part of me wanted to. Like, how could he do this to his own kid and not feel any remorse? It felt so wrong, and I was angry enough that I almost considered it. But then I remembered what that would mean for my mom and siblings. If my dad got in trouble, the fallout wouldn't just hit him. My mom, who's not even a citizen, would probably get deported, and my little brothers would be left with no one. It's messed up, right? My dad's the one who screwed me over, but I couldn't do anything about it because my whole family would end up paying for his mistakes. So, I told the financial aid officer I couldn't go down that road. She understood but said there wasn't much more they could do. I left the office feeling worse than before, like I'd hit a dead end. A few days later, I was sitting in my dorm, staring at the eviction notice I'd gotten, when I got a text from my sister, Lisa. Now, Lisa and I hadn't talked in a while. Our relationship was pretty strained because of our parents, mostly because my dad had treated her like garbage too. But I guess she'd heard what was going on and wanted to check in. She asked how I was doing, and I told her everything, just kind of venting. I didn't expect much, but she ended up being way more supportive than I thought. She told me about how our dad had screwed her over too, back when she was in college. Apparently, he'd maxed out her credit cards and left her with a mountain of debt, which she'd been paying off for years. She said she had to drop out because of it, and that's why she ended up cutting ties with him and mom. It felt weird hearing her side of things. I mean, I knew our dad was a mess, but I didn't realize just how bad it had been for her. It was like this dark family secret no one had ever talked about. The more we talked, the more I realized we had both been through the same thing. We were both victims of our dad's lies and manipulations. Lisa told me that cutting them off had been the best thing she ever did, even though it had been hard at first. She said she felt freer than she ever had. And even though she wasn't in the best financial shape, at least she didn't have them controlling her life anymore. I felt this weird mix of relief and sadness after our conversation. On the one hand, I finally had someone in my family who understood what I was going through. On the other, it made me realize how deeply screwed up my family was. I mean, if Lisa had gone through all this before me and no one had done anything about it, what chance did I have? But at the same time, it gave me a little bit of hope. If Lisa had managed to pull herself out of the mess, maybe I could too. Maybe I didn't need to rely on my parents anymore. Maybe it was time to start figuring things out for myself. After that conversation, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for my dad to pay the housing fees. I wasn't going to let him keep dragging me down. I started looking for part-time jobs around campus, something I could do while keeping up with my classes. It wasn't easy, and the pay wasn't great, but it was a step in the right direction. I also started talking to Lisa more. We hadn't been close in years, but reconnecting with her felt like finding a lifeline in the middle of everything. She gave me advice on how to budget, how to handle the student loans I'd probably have to take out, and just general life stuff. It was nice having someone to lean on, someone who had been through the same thing and come out the other side. I still hadn't figured out how I was going to pay off the dorm fees, but at least I wasn't sitting around waiting for my dad to fix it anymore. I was taking control, little by little, and it felt good. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel completely helpless. It wasn't going to be easy, but I knew I had to keep pushing forward. I couldn't let my dad's mistakes define my future. It was time to move on and start figuring out what kind of life I wanted without relying on anyone else to make it happen. After talking to Lisa and realizing I wasn't alone in all this, I felt like I had some clarity. I wasn't out of the woods yet, not by a long shot, but at least I wasn't waiting around for my dad to do something he clearly had no intention of doing. I got myself a part-time job on campus working at one of the dining halls. It wasn't glamorous or anything, but it paid enough to cover my essentials and at least kept me afloat for the time being. The thing is, even though I was trying to move forward, it still felt like I had this massive weight on my chest. Like my parents were still in the background, messing with my head, and I couldn't fully shake them off. My dad would text me every once in a while, usually with some lame excuse about why he still hadn't gotten the money. He'd promise again and again that he'd get it soon, or that he was working on it. But I'd learned not to hold my breath. At one point, he actually had the nerve to call me up and say he could have paid the housing fees, but he was waiting on a better deal. Like, what? A better deal on what? A last-minute miracle? I didn't even know how to respond, so I just let him ramble on, tuning out halfway through his speech. It was always the same thing, a whole bunch of nothing. Meanwhile, my mom was still trying to play peacemaker, acting like I should be grateful that my dad was even trying at all. She'd call me up, tell me I needed to give him more credit, and then hit me with a guilt trip about how hard things were for the family. But that was her thing, right? Defending him, even when he was clearly in the wrong. I guess she didn't know any other way. Anyway, as the semester went on, I managed to scrape together enough from my job and some savings to make a partial payment toward my dorm. It wasn't enough to clear the whole balance, but it was something, and at least it bought me some more time before I got kicked out. I was juggling work and school, barely getting enough sleep, but I was managing. I guess you could say I was in survival mode. One night, I was sitting in my dorm, exhausted from my shift at the dining hall, when I got another text from my dad. This one was different, though. It wasn't his usual excuses or empty promises. Instead, it was short and to the point. Need your help. Call me. At first, I was tempted to ignore it. I mean, after everything, why would I even consider helping him? But curiosity got the better of me, so I called him back, half expecting another round of BS. When he answered, he sounded off. Not his usual fake confident self. He sounded nervous, maybe even desperate. I asked him what was going on, and he launched into this story about how he'd gotten in over his head with some debts he hadn't mentioned before. He said he was being hounded by creditors and that if he didn't pay up soon, things were going to get ugly. I didn't know what to say. Like, this was classic my dad behavior. Digging himself into a hole and then expecting someone else to pull him out. But even still, I felt this tug. Despite everything, he was still my dad, and a part of me didn't want to see him completely crash and burn. But at the same time, I was so done with his nonsense. I couldn't believe he was asking me for help when he hadn't even been able to help me with my own situation. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked him, not really sure where this was going. "I need you to help me," he said, his voice shaky. "I'm out of options here. I don't know what else to do." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything he'd put me through, now he wanted me to bail him out? I can't help you, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm barely holding things together as it is. He didn't like that. He started going on about how he was my father and how it was my responsibility to help the family. Same old guilt-tripping tactics, but this time they weren't working on me. I told him I wasn't going to get dragged into his mess, not anymore. He got quiet for a second, and then he said something that really threw me. If you don't help me, I'm going to lose everything, he said, his voice almost a whisper. And your mother. She'll be the one who pays for it. That hit me like a punch to the gut. He knew exactly what he was doing, pulling my mom into it like that. He knew I still cared about her, and he was using that to try and manipulate me. I could feel my anger boiling up again, but I kept it in check. That's not on me, I told him. You've made your choices. I'm not going to bail you out. Before he could say anything else, I hung up. My hands were shaking, and I could feel this mix of anger and guilt swirling inside me. I knew I'd done the right thing by refusing to help him, but it didn't make it any easier. I felt like I was caught in this never-ending cycle of trying to break free from my parents, only to have them pull me back in with their drama. The next few days were rough. I couldn't stop thinking about that phone call, wondering if I'd made the right choice. I knew logically that it wasn't my responsibility to fix my dad's problems, but the guilt was still there. My mom was stuck in that mess too, and no matter how much I tried to distance myself, it felt like I was abandoning her. But then I talked to Lisa again. I told her about the call, about how our dad was trying to guilt me into helping him. She didn't hesitate for a second. You did the right thing, she said firmly. He's using you, just like he used me. Don't let him drag you down with him. Hearing her say that was exactly what I needed. It was like a weight lifted off my chest, even if just a little. I wasn't alone in this. Lisa had been through it too, and she was living proof that it was possible to get out and stay out. That's when I realized I had to set boundaries. I couldn't keep letting my parents pull me into their mess every time things went wrong. It was time to start looking out for myself, even if it meant distancing myself from them more than I already had. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only way I was going to survive this. So I made a decision that night. From now on, I wasn't going to let my dad's problems become my problems. I'd help where I could, sure, but I wasn't going to sacrifice my own future for the sake of his mistakes. It was time to start building a life for myself, without all the chaos they brought into it. And for the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I was on the right path. After I made that decision to cut myself off from my dad's mess, things didn't magically get better. But I did feel like a weight had been lifted off me. For once, I wasn't waiting on him to do something or trying to clean up his disasters. I had my own problems, sure. My dorm fees still weren't fully paid, and I was struggling to balance school and my job, but at least I knew where I stood. I wasn't tied to his promises anymore. That was something. But of course, my dad wasn't about to let me go that easily. It didn't take long before he tried to pull me back in. It started with texts, little guilt-trippy messages about how things were falling apart, how the family needed me, how I was being selfish for not helping. I ignored them at first. I had already made up my mind not to get sucked back in, and I didn't need his drama on top of everything else I was dealing with. Then one day my mom called. I hadn't really talked to her much since everything went down. She usually only called to defend my dad or to tell me I needed to apologize for whatever reason, but this time her tone was different. She wasn't yelling or guilt-tripping me. She just sounded tired, like really worn out. I knew things at home weren't great. My dad had his debts piling up and they were still living in that hotel, but I guess I hadn't realized how bad it had gotten. My mom said they were on the verge of losing the room, that they didn't have enough money to stay there much longer. She said they were running out of options and didn't know what to do. The thing is, I felt bad for her. I really did. I could hear it in her voice how desperate she was. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another way for my dad to get me to cave. He knew I cared about my mom, and he was using her to get to me. It was hard, though, because I didn't want to leave her in that situation. I didn't want my brothers to suffer because of the choices my dad had made. I told her I couldn't help financially, that I was barely making it myself. I could tell she was disappointed, but she didn't push like she usually did. Instead, she asked if I could come home for the weekend just to talk. She said my dad wouldn't be there, that he was off dealing with his debts or whatever, and she just wanted to see me. I agreed, mostly because I felt guilty. I figured maybe I could help in some other way, even if it wasn't with money. When I got home, it was even worse than I expected. The hotel they were staying at was this rundown place, way out on the edge of town. The room was cramped, with my mom, my two younger brothers, and their stuff all crammed into this tiny space. It smelled like old carpet and mildew, and there were stacks of papers and bills scattered around. My mom looked exhausted. She'd always been this strong, put-together person in my mind, but seeing her like that, it really hit me. We sat down to talk, and she told me more about what had been going on. My dad's debts were bigger than I thought, and he wasn't making any progress in paying them off. He'd been borrowing money from anyone he could, including some family members who weren't exactly happy about it. The whole situation was spiraling out of control, and my mom was just trying to hold everything together. But then she said something that really threw me. She asked if I could take in my younger brothers for a little while, just until they got back on their feet. She said it would be temporary, just a couple of months, but that they needed some stability, and right now they weren't getting it. I sat there, stunned. I hadn't expected that at all. I mean, I love my brothers, but I'm in no position to take care of anyone right now. I'm barely taking care of myself. I'm still living in a dorm, working a part-time job to pay my own bills, and now she wanted me to be responsible for 2 kids? I didn't even know what to say. I don't know if I can do that, I told her, trying to be gentle about it. I'm not in a place where I can take care of them. I barely have enough for myself. She nodded, but I could see the disappointment in her face. I understand, she said quietly, but I knew it wasn't what she wanted to hear. I just don't know what else to do. We sat in silence for a while after that. I could tell she felt trapped, and honestly, I felt guilty for not being able to help more. But at the same time, I knew I couldn't take on that kind of responsibility. I wasn't equipped for it, and I didn't want to end up resenting them for something that wasn't their fault. Before I left, I told my mom I'd help however I could, but I couldn't take my brothers in. I offered to help her look for other options, maybe find some kind of assistance program or something, but I could tell she wasn't hopeful. She thanked me for coming, but I could see it in her eyes. She felt like I was letting her down. Driving back to school, I couldn't stop thinking about the whole situation. I kept going back and forth in my head, wondering if I'd made the right decision. On one hand, I knew I couldn't realistically take in my brothers. I wasn't in a stable enough place for that. But on the other hand, they were my family. How could I just leave them in that situation? I called Lisa when I got back to my dorm. I told her everything that had happened, and like always, she was straight with me. You did what you had to do, she said. You can't save everyone, and you can't set yourself on fire to keep them warm. Trust me, I've been there. It's not your job to fix their mess. She was right. I knew she was right, but it didn't make it any easier. I guess part of me still felt like I owed them something, even after everything. It's hard to shake that feeling, you know? Like, they're still my family, and as messed up as everything is, I still care about them. But Lisa was right. I couldn't let myself get dragged down by their problems. I had to start looking out for myself, or I'd end up in the same position they were in, and that was the last thing I wanted. The next few weeks, I focused on getting through the semester. I put my head down, went to work, studied as much as I could, and just tried to stay on track. My grades weren't great, but they weren't terrible either. I was getting by, and for now, that was enough. I still felt guilty about my mom and my brothers, but I knew there was only so much I could do. I had to draw the line somewhere, or I'd never be able to break free. It was hard, but I kept reminding myself that it wasn't my job to fix everything. And maybe, just maybe, I was starting to figure out how to move forward without them pulling me back down. As the semester went on, things kind of settled into this weird routine. I was still working at the dining hall, scraping by with the money I made from that, and trying to keep up with my classes. My grades were better, but not where they should have been. Honestly, I was just exhausted all the time. Between working, studying, and the stress of everything happening with my family, I felt like I was just in survival mode. My dad kept sending me texts here and there asking for updates on my life, and sometimes dropping hints that they were still struggling. It was always the same, how they needed a little help, how things would get better soon. But I'd made my decision. I wasn't going to let myself get pulled back into their mess. I'd told him no enough times that the guilt was starting to wear off. I guess when you hear the same sob story over and over, it just loses its power. One weekend, out of nowhere, my dad called me again. I debated answering, but figured it would be better to just get it over with. When I picked up, his voice was tense. He told me that he and my mom had been fighting nonstop, and she had finally had enough. She'd left the hotel with my younger brothers and gone to stay with a friend. He made it sound like it was some huge betrayal, like she was abandoning the family. But I couldn't help but feel relieved. I knew she was in a toxic situation, and if this meant she was finally standing up for herself, maybe things would actually change. I didn't really know what to say, though. I mean, what do you even say to that? I told him I was sorry things had gotten so bad, But I wasn't about to get sucked back into their drama. He started ranting about how she wasn't being fair, how she was overreacting, and how he was still trying to fix things. But the more he talked, the more I realized that he wasn't really upset about her leaving. He was upset that he'd lost his control over her. It's crazy, but for the first time in my life, I saw my dad for what he really was. Not just some clueless guy who'd made a few mistakes, but someone who manipulated the people around him to keep them dependent on him. And now that my mom had finally broken free, he was panicking because he didn't know how to function without her. I didn't say much during the call. I just let him rant until he finally gave up and hung up. But after that, I started thinking about everything. About how my whole life, my parents had been controlling me the same way. They'd used guilt and manipulation to keep me in line, to make me feel like I owed them something. And it worked for a long time. But now I was seeing things more clearly. I talked to Lisa about it later that night. She wasn't surprised at all. She said that's just how our dad operated. He'd done the same thing to her for years before she finally cut him off. It was weird, though, because even though I was relieved my mom had left him, part of me felt guilty for not being there for her. I mean, I knew it wasn't my job to fix things, but it still felt wrong to just watch it all fall apart. Lisa, being Lisa, didn't let me sit in that guilt for too long. She reminded me that I'd done everything I could and that my mom had made her choice to stay with him for so long. It wasn't on me to rescue her, and she had to figure things out on her own. I knew she was right, but it was still hard to shake that feeling of responsibility. Over the next few weeks, things got quieter. My dad stopped calling as much, and I didn't hear much from my mom either. It felt strange, like this calm after the storm. I wasn't sure if they were still fighting or if they'd somehow patched things up. Part of me wanted to check in, but the other part of me knew I needed to keep my distance. I couldn't get sucked back into their problems again. During that time, I started focusing more on myself, on getting through my classes, figuring out my next steps, and just trying to rebuild my life outside of all the chaos. It was hard, but for the first time, I felt like I was actually in control. I wasn't waiting on anyone else to save me. I was doing it on my own. I also started seeing a counselor at school. It wasn't something I'd ever thought I'd do, but after everything that had happened, I figured it couldn't hurt to talk to someone. It was weird at first, opening up to a stranger about all the stuff I'd been through, but it actually helped a lot. The counselor helped me sort through all the guilt and frustration I'd been carrying for so long, and for the first time, I started to see things from a different perspective. She told me something that really stuck with me. You're allowed to take care of yourself first. You can't pour from an empty cup. It sounds simple, but it hit hard. I'd spent so much time worrying about my family, about what they needed, and how I could help them, that I'd completely ignored my own needs. It was time to change that. By the end of the semester, I felt like I was finally starting to find my footing again. My grades were solid, and I was even considering taking on more hours at the dining hall to save up some extra cash. I wasn't where I wanted to be yet, but I was getting there, slowly but surely. Then, one day, out of the blue, my mom called. She told me she'd left my dad for good. She'd found a place to stay with a friend, and she was figuring things out with my younger brothers. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. I could hear the relief in her voice, and for the first time in a long time, she sounded free. I didn't know how to respond at first. Part of me wanted to jump in and help, to offer whatever support I could, but the other part of me knew I needed to keep my boundaries. So I told her I was proud of her for leaving, and that if she needed anything, I was here to talk. But I didn't offer more than that. I couldn't. After we hung up, I sat there for a while, just processing everything. It felt like this huge chapter of my life was finally closing. My parents were no longer the center of my world, and I wasn't responsible for fixing their problems anymore. It was a strange feeling, liberating, but also a little scary. But I knew one thing for sure. I was moving forward. My family would always be there, in some way or another, but they didn't control me anymore. I was done with that part of my life, and now it was time to focus on what came next. Whatever that was, I was ready. Fiancé and stepdaughter scam me out of $124,000 to fund ex-husband's lavish life. All right, so I'm Greg, 49, and I've been with my fiancée Amanda for 15 years. Never married, but we've been living together long enough that it feels like it. Now, Amanda's daughter Cassie, who's 25, is getting married to her boyfriend Max. And like an idiot, I agreed to pay for the wedding. I thought, hey, I've been in Cassie's life since she was 10. She's practically my kid, right? Wrong. I'm not rolling in cash, but I've done well for myself with my own business. I'm not trying to brag, just saying I've worked hard to get where I am. Anyway, Cassie's dream wedding is some big fancy deal, and somehow the budget ballooned to around 100,000 pounds. That's like $124,000 in US dollars. Yeah, crazy, I know. But I didn't want to be the bad guy and ruin her big day, so I just went along with it. I thought it would all be worth it, to see her happy. The first red flag was when the wedding invitations went out. I noticed my own mom and stepkids weren't on the list. Amanda's side? All there. Max's side? Covered. I asked Amanda about it, and she says, "Oh, it was probably just an oversight. Cassie must have forgotten." Seriously? My mom gets forgotten from her granddaughter's wedding? That didn't sit right with me, but I let it go. I didn't want to make a scene, figured it'd get fixed. So I bring it up to Cassie a few days later, all casual like, "Hey, what's up with the invites? My mom and the kids didn't get one." She acts surprised and says it's a no-kids wedding, which, okay, fine. But then I find out Max's nieces and nephews are invited. So now I'm sitting there thinking, what the hell? I ask her why my stepkids aren't invited if it's a no-kids thing. She fumbles around, saying it's just a mistake, and she'll fix it. Now, here's where things start really getting weird. A couple of nights later, we're having this nice family dinner with Max's parents at my place, and Cassie starts talking about the wedding. Everything's going fine, and then out of nowhere, she drops this bomb. She's decided that her real dad, Tony, who's been a total deadbeat her whole life, is going to walk her down the aisle. I'm sitting there, completely blindsided. I mean, this guy has been out of the picture for decades. He's never paid child support, never showed up for her, and all of a sudden he's daddy of the year because he reached out to her 6 months ago? The same guy who ghosted her for years now gets the honor of walking her down the aisle? What about me? I've been the one who raised her, took care of her, and let's not forget I'm the one paying for this whole thing. So I look at her, totally shocked, and say, "Wait, I thought I was walking you down the aisle." Cassie doesn't even blink. She just says, "Yeah, I thought about it, but it's important to me that my real dad walks me. He's my biological father." Now I'm pissed, but I'm trying to keep my cool because we've got guests. So I calmly ask, "Well, if your biological dad is walking you down the aisle, is he also going to help with the wedding costs?" Cassie just shrugs and says, "No, of course not. You've always said you'd pay for it." At that point, I lost it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So let me get this straight," I said, my voice getting louder. "I pay for your 80,000 pounds wedding, but some deadbeat who's done nothing for you gets to walk you down the aisle? How does that make any sense?" Cassie goes quiet, and Amanda, sitting next to me, looks like she's about to explode. I could tell she was embarrassed in front of Max's parents. But honestly, I didn't care at that point. It felt like I'd been slapped in the face. And it wasn't just the walk down the aisle, it was the whole situation. Here I am, shelling out 80,000 pounds, which is no small chunk of change, and I'm just supposed to be the guy writing checks while the deadbeat gets all the glory? Nah, that wasn't gonna fly with me. Max's parents, sitting across from me, look super uncomfortable, like they're not sure if they should say something or just stay quiet. Amanda finally speaks up, saying something like, "Greg, we've been planning this for over a year. You can't just back out now." Oh, but I could, and I did. I stood up from the table and said, "If your real dad is good enough to walk you down the aisle, he's good enough to pay for the wedding. I'm done. You can figure it out." The room went dead silent. Cassie looked like she was going to cry. Amanda was glaring at me like I'd just ruined everything. And Max's parents? They just sat there, looking like they wanted to disappear. I didn't care, though. I'd had enough. All right, so after the whole dinner fiasco where Cassie announced her deadbeat dad would be walking her down the aisle, things in my house turned into a total mess. I thought Amanda and Cassie would cool off after a day or two, maybe realize they were wrong, and we'd talk it out like adults. But nah, they doubled down hard. The next morning, Amanda storms into my office, absolutely livid. She's yelling about how I've embarrassed her and ruined all the wedding plans. It wasn't even about the wedding itself anymore. She was just pissed that I made her look bad in front of Max's family. Not once did she stop to think about how I felt after raising her daughter for 15 years, only to be treated like some side character in her life. She hits me with, "We've already paid deposits on everything. You can't just pull out now, Greg." I told her, "I can and I will. If Cassie wants her biological father to be her main guy at the wedding, let him handle the costs." Amanda went off about how we couldn't get refunds, that pulling out now would mean losing everything. I wasn't buying it, though. So I grabbed my laptop and checked out the contracts I'd signed with the vendors. Most of them had cancellation fees, sure, but we were still within the window to get most of the money back. She didn't believe me, of course, so I showed her. And that's when she switched tactics. Now, it wasn't about me ruining the wedding, it was about how I was letting down family. She actually said, Cassie is your daughter. Don't you want to see her happy? That hit me like a brick. I thought about it for a second. And yeah, I did want to see her happy. I mean, I'd been there for all her major life moments, her high school graduation, when she got into college, her first job. But the thing that was gnawing at me was how she could just replace me like I was nothing. How could she just drop me after all those years? But then I remembered the night before, sitting at that dinner table, hearing her talk about her real dad like he was some kind of hero. That brought me right back to reality. So I stood firm and said, if Tony is the one walking her down the aisle, he can be the one to pay for it. Amanda wasn't hearing it. She kept saying that Tony didn't have the money, that he was broke, and that I was supposed to step up and be the bigger person. I shot back with, I'm not a piggy bank, Amanda. You want a wedding? You figure it out. Then came the real kicker. Amanda dropped the bombshell. Whoops, sorry for using that word. She tells me that I wasn't just paying for the wedding. Nope. Cassie and Max had also planned this lavish honeymoon in Mauritius, and guess who was footing the bill for that too? Yep, me. The tickets alone cost around £30,000, about $37,500. First class and everything. Now, you have to understand, I never agreed to pay for the honeymoon. I thought I was just handling the wedding expenses, which was already a ridiculous amount. So I asked her straight up, since when was I paying for their vacation? She tried to downplay it, saying Cassie and Max had just assumed I'd cover the whole thing, since I was already handling the wedding. Like, seriously? I was just supposed to assume that I'd be shelling out for a honeymoon too? I laughed, but not in a funny way. More like one of those, I can't believe this is actually happening kind of laughs. I told Amanda, there's no way I'm paying for them to go on a fancy vacation. That's not my problem. She flipped out, saying I was ruining everything for Cassie and that I was being selfish. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I'm the selfish one? I was about to spend nearly £100,000 on a wedding, and now I'm supposed to add another £30,000 for a vacation? That's almost £130,000, about $160,000, down the drain, all because Cassie wanted to play pretend with her bio dad and live like royalty for a week. At this point, I was done. I grabbed my phone, started calling up the vendors, and began the cancellation process. The venue said I'd get a partial refund, but it was better than nothing. The caterer was able to refund most of the deposit, but it'd take a couple weeks. Honestly, I didn't care how long it took, as long as I wasn't throwing more money into this black hole. Now, here's where things get really crazy. Cassie found out what I was doing, probably because Amanda told her, and she stormed into the house, screaming at me, "How could you do this? You promised. We've been planning this for a year." I stayed calm and told her, I didn't promise anything. If you want your real dad to walk you down the aisle, he can pay for it. You're not getting a free wedding and a free vacation out of me. She lost it. She started calling me every name in the book, saying I was ruining her life, and how she deserved this big wedding because it was her dream. And then, the part that really got me, she said, "You're not my real dad anyway. Why should you care?" That was it. I was done. I told her to get out of my house. Amanda tried to calm things down, but I wasn't having it. I told them both they had a week to pack up and leave. I wasn't going to be disrespected in my own home. The thing is, I wasn't even mad about the money anymore. It was the fact that after all these years, I was still being treated like an outsider. I had given Cassie everything, a roof over her head, food on the table, and yeah, even love. But apparently that wasn't enough. All that mattered was that I had money, and they wanted to use me for it. A few days later, I went through my bank statements and changed all my passwords. No more access for Amanda or Cassie. If they wanted to throw a wedding and go on vacation, they'd have to figure it out themselves. I wasn't about to be used anymore. Update 1. So after I canceled the wedding and told Amanda and Cassie they had a week to move out, things in the house got real awkward. I could feel the tension every time I walked into a room. Amanda wasn't talking to me unless it was to argue. And Cassie? She acted like I didn't even exist. It was like I was the villain in a movie, but all I did was stop them from using me like a human ATM. The thing is, I thought maybe they'd cool off, take some responsibility, and try to make things right. I don't know. Maybe I was being too optimistic, but nope. They just kept acting like I was the one in the wrong for pulling the plug on the whole thing. Amanda kept saying stuff like, "You're tearing this family apart, Greg. Is that what you want?" And every time I heard it, I just thought, family? Since when? A couple of days go by, and I hear Cassie on the phone with Max. She's freaking out because, surprise, they can't afford to pay for the wedding themselves. Apparently, Max's family wasn't as loaded as I thought. I mean, they had a nice house and all, but they weren't sitting on piles of cash. They were probably counting on me to pay for everything too. Cassie was crying, saying they had no idea what they were going to do now. I could hear her through the walls, and part of me felt a little bad. I don't hate the girl, you know? I raised her. But after the way she treated me, I wasn't going to cave. I stayed strong because honestly, I knew if I gave in now, they'd just keep taking advantage. Now, here's where things get interesting. About a week later, after they were supposed to be moving out, Amanda comes into the kitchen while I'm making coffee. She looks serious, like she's been thinking about something for a while, and says, "Greg, we need to talk." I'm like, "Yeah? What about?" She sits down and starts going on about how things have gotten out of control, that maybe they were wrong for assuming I'd pay for everything, but that Cassie's wedding is still important, and we should find a way to make it work. I cut her off and said, "Amanda, I'm not paying for the wedding or the honeymoon. We've been through this." But then she dropped something I wasn't expecting. She tells me that Cassie's biological dad, Tony, the deadbeat who never paid a penny in child support, had recently come into some money. Apparently, he'd won a settlement from an old work injury lawsuit, something like £25,000, around $30,000. Not enough to cover the whole wedding, but a decent chunk. And guess what? He wasn't willing to put a single pound toward the wedding. Nothing. Not even after everything Cassie did to bring him back into her life. Amanda told me that Tony basically said, "I've got my own plans for that money." I almost laughed, but I held it in. So this guy, who Cassie is letting walk her down the aisle, gets a fat check and won't even help his own daughter with her wedding? Meanwhile, I'm supposed to cover the whole thing? Yeah, no thanks. I looked Amanda straight in the eyes and said, "And you still think I should pay for this wedding?" She sighed and said, "I know it's a lot to ask, but I didn't realize Tony wouldn't help at all. I thought he'd at least pitch in." At this point, I'm thinking, this whole thing is a disaster. But then Amanda says something that really took me by surprise. She goes, "Cassie doesn't want to move out." Now that was news to me. I thought they'd both be ready to pack up and leave after I cut off the wedding money, but apparently Cassie was in a panic because she had nowhere to go. Max's family didn't have room for her. And Tony? Yeah, forget about it. The guy wasn't even offering her a place to stay. So now they were trying to figure out how to stay in my house without me losing my mind. Amanda starts saying maybe we can come to some sort of compromise. "Maybe if we scale back the wedding," she says, "we could make it work with what little money we have." I wasn't buying it. I told her, "This isn't about money anymore. It's about respect. I'm not just a wallet, Amanda." She tried to argue again, saying that family is about sacrifice and supporting each other, but I'd heard enough. I cut her off and told her that Cassie and Max could figure out their own wedding, and they had until the end of the week to be out of the house. No exceptions. Amanda walked out, and I could tell she wasn't happy, but what else was there to say? I wasn't budging, but of course things weren't over yet. The next day, I get a text from Max. It was out of the blue, and he'd never reached out to me directly before. I figured he was going to apologize or something, but nope. Instead, he starts demanding that I reconsider paying for the wedding. He actually had the nerve to say, "This isn't just about Cassie, Greg. You're affecting my life too." I couldn't believe it. This guy who barely spoke to me when we met was now trying to guilt me into paying for his wedding? I didn't even respond. I just blocked his number. I wasn't about to let some 25-year-old kid tell me how to spend my money. Later that night, Amanda tells me that Max's parents had been pressuring him to reach out to me. Apparently, they were just as desperate to get this wedding paid for as everyone else. I couldn't believe how all these people saw me as nothing more than a checkbook. I told Amanda, "That's it. They need to leave by Friday or I'll start packing their stuff myself." She tried to push back, but I wasn't having it. I've already made my decision. I'm not changing my mind. By the time Friday came around, Cassie and Max had finally realized that they weren't getting a free wedding, and Tony? Well, I never heard from him again. Amanda and Cassie packed their things, and that was the last I saw of them. For the first time in weeks, my house felt quiet, peaceful even. And while it sucked that things had ended like this, I knew I made the right choice. I wasn't going to be used anymore. Update 2. So, after Amanda and Cassie moved out, I finally had my house back to myself. For the first time in what felt like forever, it was quiet. I'd like to say things went back to normal, but man, it didn't take long for the weirdness to kick in. A couple of days after they left, I started getting these random calls from unknown numbers. At first, I ignored them, but when they kept coming, I finally answered one. Guess who it was? Max's mom. Yeah, out of all people, she's the one trying to get in touch with me. Now, I barely know this woman. We've maybe exchanged a few words at family events, but we're not exactly close. She starts going on about how she's worried about Cassie and how this whole situation has been hard on everyone. I could tell right away she was fishing for something, probably trying to guilt me into changing my mind about the wedding. I cut her off and told her straight up, "Look, whatever's going on with Cassie and Max is none of my business anymore. They'll figure it out." But she wouldn't let it go. She kept talking, saying how they were struggling to find a place to live and dealing with financial stress. I wasn't buying it. I mean, come on. They were expecting me to drop around £100,000, close to $120,000, on a wedding, but now suddenly they're broke? I told Max's mom the same thing I'd been telling everyone else. It's not my responsibility. She finally got the hint and hung up, but I could tell from her tone that this wasn't over. Sure enough, a few days later, I get a text from Amanda. She hadn't talked to me since she moved out, so I was surprised to see her name pop up on my phone. I opened it up, and it was this long, rambling message about how they'd found a small apartment, but they were struggling to cover the rent. She didn't outright ask me for money, but it was clear that's what she was hinting at. I didn't even respond. I was done. But things just kept escalating from there. One afternoon, I'm sitting at home when there's a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I figured it was just a delivery. Nope. I open the door and there's Cassie standing there with Max. And they're both looking pretty rough, like they hadn't slept in days. I was caught off guard, but I wasn't about to invite them in. Cassie immediately starts with the guilt trip. "Dad, we didn't know what else to do. We're really struggling right now, and we thought maybe you could help us out just this once." She's got tears in her eyes, and I could tell she was trying to pull at my heartstrings. Max just stood there, looking awkward, not saying anything. But here's the thing. After everything that had happened, after the disrespect, the lies, and them treating me like a walking bank account, I wasn't about to give in. So I told her, "Cassie, I've done enough. You've got a real dad, remember? Maybe he can help you out." That set her off. She started yelling, saying how Tony had bailed on her again and wasn't answering her calls. She said he took his £25,000, about $30,000 settlement, and disappeared. Big surprise, right? The deadbeat dad she chose over me turned out to be a deadbeat after all. Max finally spoke up, trying to be the reasonable one. He said, "Greg, we're just asking for a little help, maybe enough to cover our first few months of rent until we get back on our feet." I wasn't having it. I looked at them both and said, "I've already helped you. I gave you 15 years of my life, and I was willing to pay for your wedding until you decided your real dad was more important than me. Now, you're on your own." Cassie started crying harder, but I could tell it wasn't because she felt bad for what she'd done. It was because her plan hadn't worked. Max was just standing there, looking defeated, and I almost felt bad for the guy. Almost. I told them both to leave, and as they walked away, Cassie turned around and said something that honestly floored me. She goes, "You're going to regret this. When I have kids, they'll never know you. You'll be the grandpa they never meet." I was stunned for a second. I mean, after everything, this was her final shot? Trying to hurt me by threatening to cut me off from future grandkids? It was such a low blow, but it didn't hit me the way she wanted it to. If she thought I was going to cave because of that, she was dead wrong. I just shook my head and said, "Good luck with that." Then I closed the door. But here's where it gets even weirder. A week later, I get an email from Amanda. Not a text this time, an actual email. She starts out by saying she's sorry for how things have turned out and that she wishes we could have worked things out differently. And then she drops the real reason she's emailing. Apparently, Max had called off the wedding. She didn't go into details, but from what I could piece together, Max finally had enough of Cassie's drama. He couldn't handle the stress, the money problems, and the fact that Cassie had burned so many bridges. He decided it wasn't worth it anymore. Amanda was asking if I could talk to Max, see if there was any way to convince him to reconsider. Like I had any influence over the guy. I hadn't even known him that long, and after everything that went down, I wasn't about to start playing matchmaker. I didn't reply to the email. What could I even say? It wasn't my problem anymore. But you know what the real kicker, sorry, there's that word again, was? A few days later, I heard from one of Amanda's friends that Tony, Cassie's bio dad, was spotted at a casino in Brighton, blowing through his settlement money like it was nothing. So while Cassie and Max were out here scrambling to pay rent, Tony was living it up, probably gambling away what little cash he had left. Honestly, the whole thing was just sad at this point, but at least I was out of it. Update 3. So after Cassie and Max showed up at my door begging for help, and after Amanda's ridiculous email asking me to fix their relationship, I thought I'd seen the last of the drama. Honestly, I was ready to move on. But of course, life had one more twist to throw at me. About a week after I got that email, I got an unexpected visitor, Amanda's brother Tim. Now, I've never been close with Tim. We've met at family gatherings, exchanged the usual pleasantries, but that's about it. So when he showed up at my house, I was immediately suspicious. What could he possibly want? Tim walks in, looking all uncomfortable, and I could tell right away he didn't want to be there. He sits down and starts with some small talk, asking me how I've been and all that. I wasn't in the mood for chit-chat, so I just asked him, "What's this really about, Tim?" He sighs and gets to the point. Cassie's in trouble. Max really left her this time, and Amanda's worried she's going to do something stupid. She's not handling things well. He looked at me like he expected me to jump up and fix everything, like somehow I was the key to making it all better. I just stared at him for a minute, trying to figure out if he was serious. "Tim, what do you expect me to do? They burned every bridge with me. I'm not swooping in to save them now." Tim shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, man, I know it's not fair, but they're really struggling. Cassie's talking about moving in with some friends, but they're not exactly the best crowd. Amanda's freaking out, and she doesn't know what to do." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They really thought I was still their safety net, even after everything. I told Tim, "I'm not responsible for Cassie's choices anymore. She made her bed, and now she's got a lie in it." Tim looked defeated, but he wasn't giving up just yet. "But what about Amanda? You guys have been together for 15 years. Don't you care about what happens to her?" And that's when it hit me. This wasn't really about Cassie at all. It was about Amanda. She'd been trying to find a way back into my life ever since I told her to move out. The email, the phone calls, the whole guilt trip about Cassie. It was all a setup to get me to take Amanda back. I stood up and looked at Tim, trying to stay calm. "I care about what happens to Amanda, but I'm not her solution anymore. She chose Cassie and Tony over me, and now she has to live with that decision. I'm done being the one they turn to whenever things go wrong." Tim didn't have much to say after that. He left, and I thought that would be the end of it, but I should have known better. A few days later, I get a letter in the mail from Amanda. Yeah, an actual handwritten letter. Who does that anymore? I almost didn't open it, but curiosity got the best of me. In the letter, Amanda basically poured her heart out. She apologized for how things went down, said she regretted how she treated me, and begged me to reconsider. She even said she'd been thinking about getting back together, starting fresh, and fixing things between us. She also mentioned that Cassie had found a new place to live, some apartment downtown, and that she was working part-time at a coffee shop to make ends meet. Apparently Tony had vanished again, this time for good, and Cassie was back to square one. Amanda said she was terrified for Cassie and didn't know what to do without me there to help. The whole thing felt like a last-ditch effort to pull me back in. But by this point, I was over it. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. Tired of the guilt trips, tired of being used, tired of always being the one to fix everyone else's problems. I'd given them 15 years of my life, and what did I get in return? Disrespect and betrayal. I crumpled up the letter and tossed it in the trash. After that, things finally started to settle down. I didn't hear from Amanda, Cassie, or Max again. For the first time in what felt like years, I had peace. No more drama, no more begging for money, no more guilt trips about being family. It was just me, in my house, living my life on my own terms. One day I got a call from my oldest son, Ben. He's 28 and has a family of his own. We don't talk as often as I'd like, but we're still close. Anyway, Ben called to tell me that his wife had just had their second child, and he wanted me to come visit. He even said they'd named the baby after me, Gregory Jr. That call meant the world to me. After everything with Amanda and Cassie, it was nice to know that someone still appreciated me. I booked a flight out to see Ben and his family, and let me tell you, holding my grandson for the first time was the best feeling in the world. It made all the crap I'd been through worth it, knowing that I had real family who cared about me. Before I left for the trip, I got one final piece of news. Remember Tony? Well, turns out, he wasn't just gambling away his settlement money. He'd also racked up a huge debt with some shady people. Word on the street was that he skipped town to avoid paying up, and nobody knew where he'd gone. Typical Tony, right? I didn't feel sorry for him. In fact, I felt a weird sense of satisfaction. Cassie had thrown me away for a guy like that, and now she was paying the price. I wasn't happy about it, but I couldn't deny that it was a little bit of karma coming back around. As for me, I was finally free. Free from the drama, the manipulation, the constant feeling that I was never enough. I was focused on my real family now, the ones who actually valued me for more than just my money. And you know what? It felt good. Really good. Really. Update 4. You asked when I thought things had finally calmed down, Something I never expected happened. You'd think after months of drama, people would just move on and leave me alone. But apparently that's not how life works. One afternoon, I get this message from someone I didn't recognize. It was from a lawyer's office asking me to call them back. I'm sitting there thinking, great, what now? I've been done with Amanda, Cassie, and the whole mess for a while now, so I couldn't figure out what this was about. I call the number, and the lawyer introduces himself and says he represents Tony. Yeah, that Tony, the deadbeat dad who vanished after blowing through his settlement money. My first reaction? Total confusion. What could Tony possibly have to do with me now? He was out of the picture, right? Well, turns out Tony had passed away. He got into some serious debt with the wrong people after losing his money gambling, and long story short, his disappearance wasn't by choice. The lawyer didn't give too many details, but it was clear Tony got in over his head, and things didn't end well for him. At first, I didn't really know how to feel about it. I mean, Tony was never a real father to Cassie, and as much as he caused problems in my life, I never wanted anything bad to happen to the guy. But here's the kicker. Sorry, I know I said I wouldn't use that word, but this really got me. Tony left everything he had to Cassie. Now, when I say everything, don't get excited. It wasn't some big inheritance or anything. The guy was broke by the time he passed. But there was one thing Tony left behind. A small house just outside of Birmingham. Apparently, it had been in his family for years, and somehow it never got sold during his many attempts to get out of debt. So, why was the lawyer calling me? Well, Tony had listed me as a backup contact because Cassie wasn't answering any of their calls. No surprise there. She'd probably moved on with her life after Max dumped her, and dealing with Tony's mess was the last thing on her mind. The lawyer asked me if I knew how to get in touch with her so they could settle everything. I sat there for a minute, thinking about whether I should get involved. I hadn't spoken to Cassie since she stormed out of my house, threatening that I'd never see her kids. Kids she didn't even have yet. But for some reason, I felt like I should let her know what was going on. So, against my better judgment, I gave the lawyer her most recent phone number and left it at that. A few days later, I get a call from Cassie. It's the first time I've heard her voice in months. And honestly, I wasn't sure how the conversation was going to go. She sounded different. Quieter, more serious. She told me she'd gotten the message from the lawyer and didn't know what to do. She didn't want anything to do with Tony's estate, didn't want the house, didn't want the responsibility. And then, something unexpected happened. She apologized for everything. I didn't know how to respond at first. Part of me was still holding on to the anger from how she treated me. But hearing her apologize, hearing the regret in her voice, it caught me off guard. She admitted that she'd been selfish, that she'd let Tony back into her life without thinking about how it would affect me, and that she regretted choosing him over me. She didn't ask for money, didn't ask for anything, really. She just wanted to apologize and say that she wished things had been different. I stayed quiet for a while, thinking about how much had changed in the past year. I'd finally gotten my peace, and I wasn't about to let myself get sucked back into the chaos. But at the same time, I felt like this was the closure I hadn't realized I needed. So I told her, Cassie, I appreciate the apology, but what's done is done. You made your choices, and I made mine. I hope things work out for you, but I'm moving on with my life. She didn't argue or try to guilt trip me like she had in the past. She just said, I understand. That was the last time we spoke. As for the house Tony left behind, she ended up selling it, using the money to get a fresh start somewhere else. I don't know where she is now, and to be honest, I don't really care. I've got my own life to live, and I'm finally free from the weight of all that drama. And you know what? It feels good to close that chapter for real this time. My stepfather and his children always hated me, but after he discovered that I had inherited my late father's property, he tried to kick me out of the house. All right, buckle up, because this is going to be a long one. About 3 years ago, things at home started to get a bit weird when my mom, out of nowhere, tells me she's dating someone new. His name's Derek, and from the first time I met the guy, I could tell something was off. He had this vibe like he was always sizing me up, trying to figure out if I was friend or foe. I was just 13 at the time, so it felt really strange having some guy I don't know trying to insert himself into our lives. Let me paint you a picture. My mom and dad hadn't been in love for who knows how long. They decided to split when I was just a little kid, but never officially divorced. They thought it'd be better for me if they both stayed under the same roof, at least until I was older. So, they were like roommates who just happened to share a kid. To the outside world, it looked like we were just one big happy family. But inside, it was anything but. Every once in a while, my dad or mom would try dating other people, but it never went well. I remember doing everything I could to sabotage their dates because, deep down, I just wanted them to get back together. Yeah, I know, pretty childish, right? But I was a kid who wanted his parents to be like everyone else's. Whenever someone new came into the picture, I'd be the first to throw a fit, hoping it would scare them off. Enter Derek. The guy was different. He had a daughter who was 15 and a son who was 18, and right from the start, none of us got along. They looked at me like I was the enemy invading their territory. It didn't help that Derek always took their side over anything, which just added to the tension. My mom thought Derek was the greatest thing since sliced bread, always going on about how understanding and great he was. But to me, he was just this dude who was trying too hard to be something he wasn't. I gotta be honest, my efforts to get rid of him were on a whole new level. I'd be extra annoying, extra loud, and extra everything just to make him think twice about sticking around. But Derek, man, he was tough as nails. He didn't budge. It's like all my tricks that used to work were suddenly useless. He just kept coming back, and my mom was eating it up. Things got real when Derek started talking about moving in with us. My mom was all for it, thinking it was the next logical step. But my dad? He wasn't having any of it. They had made a promise, way back when they decided to split but not divorce, that they would keep living together under the same roof until I was at least 18 for my sake. My dad held my mom to that promise, which really ticked Derek off. You could tell he wanted to just swoop in and play house with my mom, but my dad was the wall he kept crashing into. The tension at home was palpable. Every dinner was like sitting on a powder keg, waiting for someone to light the fuse. Derek and his kids would be on one side, my mom on another, and me and my dad just trying to not get caught in the crossfire. It was messed up. Despite all the drama, Derek did manage to move in eventually. It was after my dad got really sick. He had been in and out of the hospital, and things weren't looking great. My mom was torn up about it, and somehow, Derek moving in was supposed to make everything better. I didn't see the logic in it. How was adding more people to the mix going to help anything? Then the bomb dropped. My dad passed away from a heart attack. It was sudden, and it knocked the wind out of all of us. I thought maybe, just maybe, it would put things into perspective and make everyone realize that life's too short for all this petty drama. But I was wrong. Not even a month after my dad died, my mom announced she and Derek were getting married. They planned to have a small ceremony with just a few friends and family. To me, it felt rushed. It felt disrespectful. Like, how could she move on so fast? How could she think that bringing Derek even closer into our lives would help me deal with my dad's death? I was a mess, man. I felt like I was losing not just my dad, but my whole family. Derek and his kids didn't make it any easier. They walked around like they owned the place, barely acknowledging that my world had just been turned upside down. I kept my distance, spending more time alone in my room or out with friends, anywhere but home. The real kicker came when we got the call from my dad's lawyer. Turns out my dad had left me pretty much everything: his money, his properties, and a bunch of other stuff I didn't even know about. He had inherited a fortune from some relative years back and never told anyone. Suddenly, I wasn't just the annoying kid in the house. I was the annoying rich kid. Derek's attitude shifted overnight. Any pretense of being the cool, understanding stepdad vanished. Now, I was a threat, a roadblock to whatever plans he had for his new life with my mom. And let me tell you, it felt like war was about to break out at home. So here we are, living in this awkward setup where every day feels like a silent battle. Derek and his kids are officially part of the household, and it's like walking on eggshells all the time. After the will thing came out, Derek's been acting all sweet in front of my mom, but I can tell it's just an act. Behind that smile, there's a guy who's not happy about me being the main heir. Now let's talk about the daily life in this weird blended family. Breakfast is the worst. Imagine sitting at the table, trying to eat while Derek and his kids chat like I'm not even there. They talk about stuff like plans for the house, joking around, and it's like they're the original family and I'm the outsider. My mom tries to get me involved, but it's so forced that it just makes things more uncomfortable. One morning, things got pretty tense. Derek started talking about how we should redo the living room, talking about it like he owned the place. I couldn't help myself. I had to say something. I was like, "Don't you think we should all discuss changes in the house together?" Derek just gave me this look, like I had no business suggesting such a thing. My mom was quick to smooth things over, but it was obvious she was trying to keep the peace without taking sides. As if the mornings weren't rough enough. Let's not forget about coming home after school. I walk in, and most days, Derek's there, in what used to be my dad's chair, acting like he's the man of the house. He's usually talking business on the phone or with his kids about their day. I just head straight to my room. The less I interact, the better. But even from upstairs, I can hear them laughing and talking. It's like they're erasing every trace of my dad, one laugh at a time. Then there's the deal with chores. Derek's got this idea that everyone should pitch in equally, which sounds fair on paper, right? But the way he enforces it, you'd think we were in boot camp. He's got chores scheduled on a fridge calendar, and he checks off everything like some kind of drill sergeant. If I miss even one thing because of homework or just needing a break, he's on my case, claiming I'm not pulling my weight. It feels like he's just looking for ways to criticize me, to prove I don't fit in. And let's not forget the weekends. They're supposed to be a break from the crap of the week, right? Well, not in this house. Derek plans all these family outings, which are more about him showing off to my mom that he can blend our families together. We go to parks or some local events, stuff I used to enjoy. But now, it's all about Derek making a point, showing that he's the new head honcho, and we should all fall in line. One Saturday, this whole blending thing hit a new level of ridiculous. Derek decided we should all volunteer at some community cleanup event. Sounds noble, doesn't it? But the whole day, it was Derek this, Derek that. He was lapping up the praise from other volunteers, acting like Mr. Community Leader, while I was stuck picking up trash, feeling more like an outsider than ever. My mom was there, beaming at Derek, while I just wanted to disappear. But the real kicker is how things are when there's a disagreement. One time his daughter, who's always been a bit of a princess, decided she didn't like where I parked my bike because it was in her space, in the garage. It escalated to her yelling and Derek stepping in, not to calm things down, but to tell me I should be more considerate. Like it was my fault she was flipping out over a bike. This living situation's made my home feel like a place I just sleep and eat in. I spend more time out of the house, at friends' places, or just out walking around than I do at home. I miss how it used to be with my dad. We weren't perfect, but I never felt like I was an intruder in my own home. My mom sees some of this, I think. Every now and then she tries to talk to me about how things are going, asking if I'm okay. I just nod and say it's all good, because what can I really say? That her new husband makes me wish I lived anywhere else. That every day feels like a reminder that my dad's gone and Derek's taken over? No way. That would just start a fight, and honestly, I'm just too tired to fight anymore. It's a mess, really. Living with Derek and his kids feels like I'm in some kind of slow-motion nightmare where everything I used to love about home is being twisted into something I don't recognize. And the worst part? I've got to smile and bear it, because this is still my mom's house too, and I don't want to make her life harder than it already is. So yeah, that's my life now. Stuck in a house with a stepdad who might smile in front of my mom, but definitely doesn't want me around. Just counting the days until I can get out of here, or until something changes. So, life in the step-family circus went from bad to worse. It's like every week there's a new drama that just makes me want to pack up and disappear. But I guess I should start with the big blowout that happened not too long ago, because it really shows what's been brewing under the surface. It all kicked off over something stupid, like it always does, right? Derek's son, let's call him Mark, decided that my gaming console was community property, since it was in the living room. Never mind that I saved up for months to buy it myself. He and his sister started using it whenever they wanted, not even asking me first. I let it slide for a bit because I didn't want to start another fight. But then, I found my controllers all messed up, buttons sticky and stuff. I confronted Mark about it, keeping my cool, just asking him to respect my stuff. Well, he didn't take it too well. Started telling me how I was being selfish, how I should be more generous since we're supposed to be a family. That's when Derek jumped in, backing up his son, of course. He told me that in this house, we share everything and that I needed to stop being so possessive. The argument got heated, and my mom finally stepped in. But instead of backing me up, she sided with Derek, saying I should try to be more understanding. Man, that hurt. It's like suddenly it wasn't our home anymore. It was Derek's rules, Derek's way. This whole mess made me start thinking a lot about how things have been changing around here. Like, Derek's been slowly taking over every part of our lives. He's rearranged the living room, replaced some of my dad's old furniture with his stuff, and it's like he's trying to erase the memory of my dad completely. My room is the only place that still feels like mine, and now even that feels threatened. One night, things got real weird. I was up late, just thinking about all this stuff, and I decided to take a walk around the house. It was quiet. Everyone else was asleep, and I just needed to clear my head. As I'm walking through the living room, I noticed Derek's laptop open on the table. I know I shouldn't have, but curiosity got the better of me. I took a peek. There were emails open about property listings, big expensive places that were way beyond what we could afford. At least that's what I thought. Turns out Derek's been doing pretty well for himself, or at least That's what he wants everyone to think. The emails were to a real estate agent, talking about selling our house and buying a new one, something about needing a fresh start for our new family. I felt sick to my stomach. This was all news to me. No one had said anything about selling the house. This was the house my dad had loved, the house I grew up in. And Derek was planning to sell it like it was just another item to tick off his list. The next day, I brought it up at breakfast. I asked Derek straight up about the emails. You should have seen the look on his face. It was like he'd been caught with his hand in the cookie jar. He stumbled over his words, tried to play it off like it was just options he was looking at, nothing serious. But the cat was out of the bag now. My mom was shocked. She hadn't known about any of this either. There was this huge argument, voices raised, Derek trying to justify himself, my mom trying to understand why he'd go behind her back. I just sat there, watching this all go down, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. It was clear Derek had plans that didn't include us, or at least not me. That fight seemed to open my mom's eyes a bit. She's been a bit more cautious around Derek since then, asking him more questions, keeping a closer eye on what he does. I don't know if it'll change anything in the long run, but at least she's starting to see that Derek might not be the perfect guy she thought he was. Since then, the atmosphere at home has been tense. Derek knows I don't trust him, and I know he's not happy about me snooping around. It's like an unspoken war now. We avoid each other as much as possible, and when we do have to interact, it's short and to the point. No more fake smiles, no more pretending we're some happy family. I've started to spend even more time out of the house, staying over at friends' places whenever I can. I just can't stand being around Derek, knowing he's planning to uproot everything just for his own benefit, and my relationship with my mom, it's complicated. I'm glad she's starting to see through Derek, but there's a lot of damage there, a lot of trust that's been broken. So that's where I'm at now. Stuck in a home that feels less and less like mine, trying to hold on to the few memories I have left of my dad, and hoping that somehow things will get better. But deep down, I know I need to start making plans, start figuring out a way to get out and get on with my life. Because this isn't living. This is just surviving day by day in a house that's filled with tension and secrets. All right, so after the whole blow up about the house selling thing, you'd think Derek might lay low, but nah, that's not his style. Instead, things just ramped up more. It's like he's got something to prove, and I'm the punching bag he's picked to take it out on. Here's the lowdown on how everything spiraled even further. A couple of weeks after the email incident, Derek starts pushing for these family bonding activities. He's all about showing my mom he's this great unifier, right? So he sets up this big dinner, everyone's invited, even some of his extended family. It's supposed to be this big happy gathering, but the vibes are all off. His family's all right, I guess, but there's this undercurrent, like everyone's trying too hard to show how great everything is. During dinner, Derek keeps putting me on the spot, asking me about school and my plans for the future, stuff he never cared about before. It feels like he's setting me up, waiting for me to slip up so he can point out how I'm not living up to expectations or something. I play it cool, give him the answers he's looking for, but it's tense, man, really tense. After the guests leave, my mom pulls me aside. She's been noticing things, finally seeing how Derek's been treating me. We have this heart-to-heart, and I lay it all out for her, how I feel like Derek's trying to push me out, how it's been ever since he moved in. She listens, really listens, and I can see it's hitting her hard. She promises things are going to change, that she's going to talk to Derek, set some boundaries. I'm not holding my breath, but it's nice to see her stepping up. But here's the kicker. Things with Derek go from bad to downright ugly. The next day, he corners me when I'm coming out of my room. He's all calm and collected, too calm. He tells me he knows I've been talking to my mom, stirring up trouble. He warns me to back off, says it's for my own good. The veiled threats, the cold look in his eyes. I've never seen him like this before. I'm rattled, not gonna lie. I keep my cool, tell him I don't know what he's talking about, but inside, I'm freaking out. This guy's not just a jerk, he's manipulative, dangerous even. I avoid him after that, keep to my room, try to stay under the radar. A few days later, things come to a head. I'm home alone, just chilling, when Derek comes back early from work. He doesn't see me at first. I hear him on the phone, talking loud and angry. He's arguing with someone about money, about needing more time. He sounds desperate, nothing like the composed guy he plays in front of my mom. I stay out of sight, but I listen, trying to piece together what's going on. It sounds like he's in deep, owes money or something, and it's coming due. He ends the call, slams something down, and I realize this guy's got problems, serious problems, and he's brought them right into our home. That evening, I tell my mom what I heard. I can see the worry on her face, The realization that Derek's not who she thought he was. She's scared, I can tell, but she's also angry, angry that he's brought this danger to our doorstep. She decides then and there that she's going to confront him, ask him straight up what's going on. The confrontation is intense. I hear them in the kitchen, voices raised. Derek's defensive, trying to brush it all off as a misunderstanding, but my mom's not buying it. She's got this strength I haven't seen in her in a long time. She tells him she won't tolerate lies, won't let him endanger us with whatever mess he's in. Derek tries to smooth talk his way out of it, but she's firm, tells him he needs to sort himself out, or he's out. The next few days are awkward as hell. Derek's on thin ice and he knows it. My mom's watching him like a hawk, and I'm just trying to stay out of the way, keep my head down. But there's this tension in the air, like a storm waiting to break. It's quiet, too quiet. Then one evening it all comes crashing down. Derek's gone for most of the day, comes back late, looking a mess. My mom confronts him again, this time about where he's been, about the lies and the secrecy. It gets heated, and then all of a sudden, Derek snaps. He starts yelling, saying he's had enough, that he's not going to be treated like a criminal in his own home. It's chaos. I step in, try to calm things down, but it's no use. Derek's lost it, saying he's leaving, that we'll regret ever doubting him. He packs some stuff, throws it in his car, and just like that, he's gone. The aftermath is surreal. My mom's in shock, trying to process everything. I'm just relieved he's gone, but there's this guilt too. Like maybe we pushed him too far. But deep down, I know it's better this way. Better than living with the constant tension, the threats, the lies. So now it's just me and my mom, trying to pick up the pieces, trying to rebuild something out of the wreckage Derek left behind. It's not going to be easy, but for the first time in a long time, it feels like we can breathe again, like we can make this house a home again. Thanks for sticking with me through this. It's been one hell of a ride, but I hope, the worst is behind us. So last week, Derek came back and he convinced my mom that all his problems are gone and he just needed some time to clear his mind, and my mom took him in. Of course, I was mad, but I couldn't say anything. Yesterday, Derek and I finally had it out. My mom was working late and my step-siblings were out with their friends, so it was just me and Derek at home. I didn't want to be alone with him, so I made plans with some friends and was getting ready to leave when Derek started yelling about how he wasn't my maid and wasn't going to do my dishes. I tried to keep it cool and told him I'd take care of them when I got back, but he insisted that it was my responsibility and I needed to do it now. In our house, everyone does their own dishes, and I really was planning to do them as soon as I got back, but he kept shouting and I lost my temper. We ended up screaming at each other and I cursed at him. Then out of nowhere, he accused me of sticking around just to get my mom to leave me all the stuff my dad had left behind. I was shocked. I didn't see that coming at all. He went on about how my mom had finally realized that I was just playing nice because I wanted her to leave everything to me instead of Derek and his kids. He claimed that even though I wasn't happy about my mom being with him, I was being polite to him because I wanted her to leave all that stuff to me. That's when I figured out that my mom must have lied to him, telling him that my dad had left her everything when in reality it was all mine. That explained why Derek had been acting so spiteful toward me. I guess my mom didn't want him to know that my dad hadn't left her much, just a bit of cash. When he accused me of this, I just laughed and told him the truth, and he turned pale. At first, he didn't believe me, but when I stopped laughing, he realized I was serious. I left the house after that, and he didn't say anything more. It was so stressful that I decided not to go home at all. I stayed at a friend's place, and just like I expected, my mom called me at midnight. She was furious, yelling at me for telling Derek the truth about the inheritance. I was really angry. I told her she had no reason to lie to him because she knew all the property was legally mine and that she was left with nothing. I said she was letting Derek treat me like crap because she was jealous that my dad left me everything. She tried to explain that she had been planning to talk to me later because her business had been struggling for the last few years, and my dad knew that, but he never offered to help. She also mentioned that my dad didn't like Derek, and she wanted to be with a man he didn't approve of. She claimed she hadn't noticed how Derek had been treating me because she was too distracted. But I didn't buy it. I told her I might have considered sharing the property with her if she'd been honest with me earlier, but now I thought my dad was right to leave everything to me. I didn't believe she didn't see how Derek was treating me, especially since I had been telling her for years that he was awful to me. I told her I thought the reason she hadn't said anything to Derek about his behavior was that she was afraid of losing him if she told him the truth. I figured she still cared about me, but only because it wouldn't look good socially if she kicked me out. Now, after finding out about the inheritance, she needed me around for the money. She told me to come home immediately, but I said I wasn't going back. I had already decided to leave as soon as I could. I didn't know where I'd go, but anywhere was better than living with my mom. I hung up on her and blocked her. But this morning, I woke up to a text from her, apologizing and saying she loves me and wants to keep me in her life. She asked me to come home so we could talk things over, saying that we both said a lot of hurtful things last night that we didn't mean. But I'm not so sure I didn't mean what I said, and now I feel like a terrible person for even thinking it. But honestly, I think the only reason my mom wants me to come back is that she needs the money. Would I be the a-hole if I decided not to talk to my mom? Update 1. Hey everyone, before I get into anything else, there are a few things I need to clear up. Some of you asked why I didn't just move in with other family members if I didn't want Derek living with us. The truth is, I wanted to support my mom. After losing my dad, I didn't want to lose her too. Besides the stuff with Derek, my mom and I didn't have a bad relationship. She didn't know what was going on, and things have only gotten this bad recently. Plus, my life is here, and my other relatives live far away. My grandma's sisters aren't even in the country, so moving out wasn't really an option even if I wanted to. Some of you were also curious about my parents' living situation. To clarify, my parents lived together, but they weren't a couple. They were just co-parenting me. I guess it was weird for most people, which is why their relationships didn't last long, at least until Derek came into the picture. Like a lot of you, people my parents dated didn't really understand the setup, since my parents were still living with each other and raising a child together. Eventually, my dad stopped dating, and my mom ended up with Derek. My dad would just stay in his room, and my mom had hers on the other side of the house, so it wasn't really a problem when Derek came over. I don't know if my dad still had feelings for my mom after they broke up. If he did, he hid it well, because to me, they were just friends until I was about 13 and realized they'd never get back together. Maybe he did still have feelings, maybe not. I honestly don't know, and it doesn't matter now. I talked to my dad's lawyer about the fallout with my mom. I also spoke to my grandparents on both sides, and they agreed that my mom's behavior towards me was out of line and that she should be ashamed. When they asked if I still wanted to stay with her, I said no. I'm staying with a friend for now while my grandparents fly in to help sort things out. My mom's been trying to see me every day this past week, but I haven't agreed to it. Honestly, I'm just too confused right now and don't know what her true intentions are anymore. She's been messaging me on social media from different accounts, but I'm pretty sure she's still with Derek and that they're both living in our house. I'm not going to believe anything she says until Derek is gone. Call me stubborn or whatever, but I just don't care anymore. I have to look out for myself now. I'm going to stay put until my grandparents get here so we can figure this all out together. They're out of state, and since I still need to go to school and don't want to move, I can't leave right now. I'm thinking about suggesting living on my own, but I don't know if they'll be okay with that. I have no idea what's going to happen, so I'm just hoping for the best. Update 2. Hey everyone. My grandparents flew in yesterday and took me to see the hotel where they're staying while we figure things out. My mom was there too, since she's still technically responsible for me. I'm still too young for them to seriously consider my idea of living alone, so that got shut down pretty quickly. My mom kept trying to get me to come back home with her, but I made it clear that I wasn't interested in working things out as long as Derek was still around. I told her the only way she could prove she had no hidden agenda was by kicking Derek and his kids out. If she couldn't do that, then we had nothing to talk about. She tried to argue, but she didn't want my grandparents stepping in, so she backed off. They suggested I move in with them, but neither my mom nor I were ready to give up custody just yet. No one really knew what to do. I kept telling my grandparents that I'd go back home with my mom if Derek wasn't there. They asked if I'd be willing to work things out with my mom over time, and then checked with her to see if she thought that was a fair solution. She said she'd figure out a way to make it work. Honestly, I'm surprised she agreed to it too, but I still don't know what's going to happen in the long run. For now, I'm staying at the hotel with my grandparents while my mom went home to talk to Derek. I really hope things go well, but I have no idea what to expect. My mom asked us to give her a few days to sort things out, so that's what we're doing. She doesn't know what's going to happen either. All I can do now is hope for the best. I really want to keep my family together. Update 3. Hey everyone, I went back home yesterday, and it's been a week since my last update, so my mom and Derek are getting divorced. She told us that when she went home that day, she tried to explain to Derek that she couldn't come back while he was still there. It made sense because I didn't want to be mistreated by him like before. She asked him to leave for a few weeks so we could try to work things out, but they had already been having problems. Derek was furious when I told him the truth about the property, and he felt betrayed, thinking he couldn't trust her anymore. Things were already tense, so when she suggested a break, he lost it and decided to file for divorce. Luckily, they hadn't been married long, and their finances were mostly separate, so He doesn't have much claim to anything. My mom apologized for everything. She admitted she had been a terrible person for letting Derek treat me the way he did, and she realized she had overreacted when she found out about my dad's will. She promised to be a better mom, and I'm going to hold her to that. If she doesn't follow through, I'm serious about leaving for good and applying for emancipation. I think I'm making the right choice by giving her another chance, even though I know some people might disagree. But it's my life, and if I'm wrong, that's my mistake to make. I'm going with my gut because I don't want to look back and regret not trying. Plus, she seems genuinely sorry, and I don't think she'll get back together with Derek now that she's seen his true colors. She doesn't even seem worried about the divorce. Her main concern is making sure I'm okay. We'll see how things go, but for now, I'm cautiously optimistic. Update 4. Hey everyone, it's been a while, 3 years to be exact. I wanted to give you all the update you've been waiting for about my mom. Turns out, she wasn't doing it for the land. She genuinely regretted her actions, and I know this because, despite some bumps along the way, she managed to turn her business around. In fact, she's now paying for my college education. I told her she didn't have to, but she said it was the least she could do after everything that happened since the divorce. She hasn't spoken to Derek or even mentioned him. She handled the divorce on her own terms, so she didn't need to. He just got a small settlement. My mom and I have been working hard to repair our relationship, and so far, it's going really well. Our mother-daughter bond is stronger than ever, and we try to do something fun whenever we visit family. I'm really happy with how things have turned out. It could have easily gone the other way, but I'm glad my mom took responsibility and made positive changes when given another chance. I don't regret giving her that opportunity at all. Dad paid for my cousin's college but left me out. Now he wants back in my life. But I finally found out why he did this, and the truth was not what I expected. So I'm 28 now, married to my wife, Haley, and we just had our first kid about 2 months ago. A baby boy. We've been together for a while, and having our son was honestly one of the happiest moments of my life. Naturally, we were excited and shared a few photos of him on Facebook. I thought nothing of it at first, just proud to show off my kid. But looking back, I should have known better. I haven't spoken to my dad in almost 10 years, and somehow my relatives took those photos and sent them to him. It's funny how people just can't mind their own business. Let me back up a bit to explain why me and my dad aren't exactly on speaking terms. It all goes back to when I finished high school, and things were supposed to be looking up for me. I was ready for college. I had decent grades, not top of the class or anything, but I worked hard, and I was really excited to take the next step. I wasn't expecting a handout, but I figured my dad would at least help me out with tuition, especially since he was doing pretty well for himself. Here's the thing. My cousin Peter, who's only a few months younger than me, was always around growing up. We were basically raised together, and while we were close at times, there was always this weird competition between us, almost like we were brothers, but not really. The truth is, my dad always seemed to have a soft spot for Peter. I'm not sure when I first noticed it, but it became pretty clear over the years that Peter got the better end of the deal whenever my dad was involved. Now, Peter didn't exactly have an easy life. His parents, my uncle and aunt, were always struggling to keep their cafe afloat. They were decent people, just constantly busy with their business and didn't have much time for him. So my dad stepped in. He'd take Peter out for stuff, help him with school, and was generally more present for him than Peter's own parents. I didn't think much of it back then because, I had my dad full time. It was just me and him since my mom left when I was a baby. So I guess I assumed that made me his number one priority. Boy, was I wrong. High school wasn't easy for either of us, but I worked my ass off to keep my grades up. I was doing all right. Better than Peter, actually. Peter was struggling, especially in math. I spent hours tutoring myself while Peter got help from my dad. There were times I'd look over and see my dad sitting with him at the kitchen table, going over algebra, and I'd wonder why he didn't do that with me. But I let it slide, thinking, well, Peter needs the help more. Things didn't really blow up until after we graduated. That's when the whole college thing came up. I was already stressing about how to pay for it. Like I said, I didn't expect my dad to cover the whole thing, but I figured he'd help me out at least a little bit. I even looked up scholarships and part-time jobs, trying to figure out how to make it all work. Then, my dad drops a bomb on me. We were sitting in the living room one night, and I asked him about college. Just a casual conversation, really. I was ready to talk about what schools I was looking at and what I might major in. But before I even got into it, my dad cut me off and said, "Michael, I think you should look into getting scholarships. I'm not going to be able to pay for your tuition." I just sat there, stunned. I didn't know how to respond at first because I wasn't expecting that. It wasn't like my dad was broke or struggling. He was doing well in his job, living comfortably, and I wasn't asking for the world, just some help. So I asked him why. I said, "Why can't you help me? You know how important college is to me?" He shrugged, and that's when he told me something I'll never forget. "I'm covering Peter's tuition," he said, like it was no big deal. Like I should have seen it coming. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I mean, I knew my dad had been helping Peter's family for years. He'd lend them money here and there to keep their cafe running, but this? Paying for Peter's college instead of mine? It felt like a slap in the face. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream, so I just sat there, stunned. After a minute of awkward silence, I asked, "Why him and not me? I'm your son." My dad sighed, like he was tired of explaining it to me, and said, "Peter's family is going through a tough time right now. They can't afford to send him to college, and I need to help them. You can get a scholarship or student loans. You'll figure it out. Besides, Peter's like a brother to you. You should want to help him." At that moment, I felt my blood boil. I snapped back, "He's not my brother. He's my cousin. Why are you acting like he's your son?" My dad's face went cold. He stood up, crossed his arms, and looked at me like I was some stranger. "If you're going to have that attitude, maybe it's time you find somewhere else to stay," he said. And that was it. My dad had made his choice. He chose Peter over me, and I was out. I didn't even have time to pack properly. I grabbed some stuff and left, crashing at a friend's place for a while. I had no plan, no idea what I was going to do next, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let my dad's decision ruin my life. For the next few weeks, I scrambled to find a way to pay for school. I applied for loans, scholarships, anything I could think of. But without my dad's support, none of it worked out. I couldn't afford tuition, rent, food, all the basics. So I did what I had to do. I dropped out before I even started. College wasn't happening for me. It hurt like hell, especially knowing Peter was off living the dream my dad handed him on a silver platter. That was when I realized my relationship with my dad was never going to be the same. He made his choice, and it wasn't me. From that moment on, I decided I wasn't going to rely on anyone but myself. If my own dad couldn't have my back, then I'd figure things out on my own. And that's exactly what I did. I didn't have a plan. All I knew was I wasn't going back to my dad's place. I felt completely abandoned. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was the fact that my own dad didn't see me as his priority. He'd made his decision, and that decision was Peter. I wasn't exactly swimming in options. College was out of the picture, and with no backup plan, I had to find work fast. I couldn't just stay on my friend's couch forever, so I started looking for jobs. Problem was, without a college degree, the jobs I could get weren't exactly going to pay the bills. Every job I found either paid next to nothing or expected me to work insane hours for peanuts. I was desperate, though, so I took whatever I could find. I ended up landing this temp gig at a warehouse. The pay was garbage, but at least it was something. I'd be working long hours, sweating my ass off, lifting boxes, and doing all kinds of grunt work. The kind of stuff you do when you don't really have any other choice. It sucked, but I didn't have any room to be picky. During this time, my dad tried to reach out. He sent me a couple of texts, nothing too deep, just the usual, "How are you doing?" or "You can come home anytime." But here's the thing. He never mentioned anything about helping me with school. Not once did he say, "Let's figure this out," or "I'll help you with your tuition." It was like that part of the conversation never happened, and I was just supposed to forget about it. Like we could go back to normal without fixing anything. I wasn't having it. I ignored his messages, convinced that if he couldn't even acknowledge what he did, then there was no point in talking. How do you just pretend that you didn't screw over your own kid? I couldn't get over it. Every time I thought about Peter going off to college, living in a dorm, doing the whole campus life thing while I was stuck in a warehouse, it made my blood boil. And my dad was the one who made that choice. But life goes on, right? At least that's what everyone kept telling me. I tried to just keep my head down and focus on work, but it wasn't easy. Every day was a grind. The job was exhausting, and I was barely scraping by. I had rent to pay, groceries to buy, and bills stacking up, all while trying to figure out what I was supposed to do with my life now that college wasn't an option. I couldn't see a way out of the hole I was in, and honestly, I started feeling pretty low. It didn't help that I was completely on my own. My dad wasn't there, and neither were my uncle or aunt. They didn't reach out to check on me once, which just confirmed what I already knew. They didn't care. Peter was their golden child, and I was just there. Forgotten. It was like I didn't exist anymore, except when my dad wanted to send a half-assed text pretending like everything was fine. But here's the thing. Even though I felt like crap, I knew I had to keep going. I didn't have a choice. I couldn't just sit around feeling sorry for myself. So I worked my ass off at that temp job, saving up whatever little money I could. I had this mindset that if no one was going to help me, I'd just have to do it myself. I wasn't about to let my dad's decision define my life. After a few months of grinding, I finally got lucky. The company I was working for offered me a permanent position. It wasn't exactly glamorous, but it was stable, and the pay was a little better. It was something, and I was relieved to have at least some stability in my life. The job came with benefits too, which was a big deal for me at the time because I didn't have health insurance or anything like that. So, for the first time in a while, I felt like things were starting to look up, even if it wasn't the life I had imagined for myself. During all this, I was still pissed at my dad, and that anger kept me going in a weird way. I didn't want to prove him right by failing. If he was going to bet on Peter, fine, but I was going to make something of myself, even if I had to drag myself there. I kept my distance from my dad, didn't respond to any of his messages, and didn't look back. I figured if he couldn't be there for me when I needed him most, then I didn't need him now that I was trying to figure things out on my own. Meanwhile, I started hearing through the grapevine that Peter was doing well in college. He'd send updates to the family about his grades, his new friends, all that college experience stuff I never got to have. And my dad would gush about it to anyone who would listen. Every time someone told me how proud my dad was of Peter, it felt like another punch in the gut. My own dad couldn't even say he was proud of me for holding my life together. But Peter? He was like the second coming of Christ in my dad's eyes. That's when it really hit me. My dad didn't just choose Peter's education over mine. He chose Peter, period. He was more proud of what Peter was doing than anything I had done. And that hurt like hell. I started to feel like maybe my dad never really cared about me the way a dad should. I don't know if he ever did, or if I was just too blind to see it growing up. Either way, it was obvious now. Peter had replaced me, and I had to learn to live with that. I kept grinding at my job, slowly working my way up. It wasn't the most exciting life, but I had a roof over my head, and I was doing it on my own. I didn't need anyone's help, least of all my dad's. And honestly, that started to feel like its own kind of victory. I didn't need to go to college to make something of myself. I was proving that with hard work, you can get by, even when the odds are stacked against you. Still, every time I thought about what my life could have been like if my dad had just helped me out a little, it pissed me off all over again. But I guess that's just part of the deal. You live with the choices people make for you, and you either let them define you, or you figure out a way to rise above it. I wasn't going to let my dad's choice ruin me, even if it meant carrying that anger around with me for a long time. I was determined to keep going, and no matter how much it hurt, I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me fail. A few years down the line, things started to change. I was still working at the warehouse, but I'd put in enough time and effort that I wasn't just some temp worker anymore. I'd gotten promoted to a more stable position, and while it wasn't exactly my dream job, it was something I could be proud of. I was finally making enough money to live comfortably, not just paycheck to paycheck like before. It felt like all those long hours, the sleepless nights, and just pushing through had finally paid off. The job came with some decent benefits too: health insurance, a retirement plan, stuff I never thought about back when I was younger. But now it was the kind of security I'd been desperate for. I wasn't rolling in money or anything, but I wasn't drowning in bills anymore, and that made a huge difference. For the first time in a while, I felt like I had some control over my life again. Around this time, I met Haley. It was kind of random, honestly. She was working in a different department at the same company, and we crossed paths in the break room one day. I didn't think much of it at first, just a casual chat over crappy coffee. But one thing led to another, and we started talking more and more until it became something real. We clicked in a way that felt easy, and before long, we were dating. Being with Haley made me realize just how much of my energy I'd been putting into being angry about my dad. She was like this breath of fresh air, someone who made me feel like I didn't have to keep proving myself to the world or carrying around all that bitterness. She didn't care about where I went to school or that I didn't go to school at all. She just saw me for who I was, and for the first time, that felt like enough. Of course, while all this was happening, my dad kept trying to reach out. His texts never stopped, but they were always surface level. Stuff like, "Happy birthday, hope you're doing well," or "Merry Christmas, miss you." But every time I just couldn't bring myself to respond. It's not that I didn't think about it. I'd stare at those texts for a while sometimes, wondering if I should just let it go and reach back out. But then I'd remember how he never apologized, never even acknowledged what he did, and all the anger would come flooding back. It's funny because by this point, I wasn't struggling anymore. I wasn't the broke kid who had to drop out of college and work whatever temp job I could find. I was doing okay. Better than okay, actually. I had a stable job, my own place, and Haley, who made everything in life feel brighter. But none of that erased the fact that my dad had chosen Peter over me when it really counted. I don't think anything could erase that. Speaking of Peter, I heard bits and pieces about him through the family grapevine. He'd graduated college and gotten a job, but from what I gathered, it wasn't the high-paying career my dad had probably envisioned for him. Apparently, he was struggling a bit, not making much money and living in a small apartment with his girlfriend. I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel like some kind of justice. Here I was, the kid who got left behind, and I was doing better than the golden child my dad had poured all his support into. It wasn't like I was keeping tabs on Peter, but people talk. Family members who I hadn't spoken to in years would randomly bring him up in conversation, usually trying to get me to reconnect with my dad. They'd say things like, "You know, Peter's not doing so great. You should talk to your dad. He misses you." But every time I heard that, it just reminded me why I kept my distance in the first place. My dad made his choice and I made mine. Haley was always super supportive during this time. She never pushed me to talk to my dad or made me feel guilty for cutting him off. In fact, she was the one who told me I didn't owe him anything. That was a game changer for me because, up until then, I'd always felt this pressure to eventually forgive him, like it was something I had to do because he was my dad. But Haley helped me see that I wasn't responsible for fixing the mess he created. That mindset shift made a big difference in how I approached my life. I stopped feeling like I was waiting for my dad to come around or for some magical moment where everything would get resolved. Instead, I focused on what I had in front of me: my job, my relationship with Haley, and the life we were building together. And things just got better from there. After a couple of years, I proposed to Haley. It wasn't some big elaborate thing. We weren't those people who needed a fancy dinner or an Instagram-worthy proposal. I just took her to a park we used to walk through on our lunch breaks, and I asked her. She said yes, of course, and we got married a few months later in a small ceremony. Just close friends and a few family members. It was perfect. And I didn't think about my dad once that day. Our life together was simple, but it was ours. We moved into a decent apartment, got a dog, and talked about starting a family someday. I finally felt like I'd made it, in my own way. I didn't need my dad's approval or his money. Everything I had I'd worked for, and I was proud of that. Of course, my dad didn't stop trying to reach out. He sent a message when he found out I got married saying something like, "I'm so happy for you and Haley. I wish I could have been there." It was almost laughable to me because, again, no mention of an apology. No acknowledgement of what went down between us. Just him acting like he should have been part of my life all along. I didn't respond. I didn't see the point. How do you let someone back in when they don't even recognize the damage they caused? It wasn't just about the money or the college thing anymore. It was about the fact that he never saw me as his priority, and nothing had changed in all the years since. So I kept living my life. Haley and I eventually decided we were ready to start a family, and that's when we had our son. He's the best thing that's ever happened to me, and holding him for the first time made me realize how much I wanted to be the kind of dad I never had. I'm not perfect, and I'm sure I'll mess up sometimes, but I know for sure I'll never make my kid feel like he comes second to anyone else. A few days after we posted the pictures of our son on Facebook, my phone rang. I looked at the screen and saw my dad's name pop up. It was like the universe was testing me. I hadn't spoken to him in almost 10 years, and suddenly, there he was, reaching out after seeing pictures of my son. Part of me wanted to just ignore it, like I had with all his texts before, but another part of me was curious. Maybe this was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment where he finally said he was sorry. Maybe becoming a grandfather would make him realize what he'd lost. So I picked up the phone. "Hey, Michael," he said, his voice almost hesitant, like he wasn't sure how I'd react. I stayed quiet for a second, waiting to see what he'd say next. He kept talking, going on about how much he missed me, how hard it's been not being in my life, and how he felt bad for not being at my wedding. All the while I was just sitting there, listening but not really feeling anything. It was all empty words. Then he brought up the pictures of my son. "I saw the pictures of your little boy. He's beautiful, Michael. I'm really proud of you." That's when I snapped. "Proud of me?" I shot back. "You're proud of me now after everything? You weren't there for any of it. You didn't help me with college. You chose Peter over me, your own son, and now you're proud of me?" The silence on the other end of the line was thick. I could tell he didn't expect that reaction, but I wasn't done. "You've never even apologized for what you did," I continued, my voice rising. "You threw me aside like I didn't matter. And now you want to come back into my life like nothing happened? He started to respond, but I cut him off. You know what? Maybe Peter is your real son. You treated him like one all those years. Maybe you and Aunt Susan were more than just family. I threw it out there, more to hurt him than anything else. I didn't believe it, not really. I just wanted him to feel as crappy as I did. But here's the thing. I expected him to get mad, to yell back, to defend himself. Instead, there was this long pause on the other end of the line, and when he finally spoke, he sounded confused. Michael, what are you talking about? He said, almost like he was struggling to process what I'd just said. His reaction caught me off guard. I was waiting for him to blow up, but instead, he sounded lost. For a second, I thought I might have hit something real, something I wasn't supposed to know. Don't play dumb with me, I said, but my voice had lost some of its edge. I was starting to wonder if I'd just stumbled onto something bigger. I see how you've always treated Peter like your favorite. Maybe there's a reason for that. There was another long pause, and I could hear him breathing like he was trying to figure out what to say. Michael, that's not true, he said quietly. I don't know why you'd think that. But the way he said it, the hesitation in his voice, it didn't sit right with me. Suddenly, I wasn't so sure I'd just made it up. I'd thrown that out there to hurt him, but his reaction wasn't what I expected. It was like he was genuinely confused, but at the same time, it felt like maybe there was something there that even he hadn't considered. I didn't know what to do with that. I'd been so sure of what I was saying, so sure that I was just lashing out, but now I wasn't sure of anything. The thought that my dad could have been cheating with his brother's wife was something I hadn't really believed until that moment. But now I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe there was more to the story. You don't know, do you? I said, half accusing, half questioning. Maybe you've been lying to yourself this whole time. Michael, that's enough, he said, his voice more firm now. I don't know what's going on in your head, but that's not what happened. I loved your mom, and I would never do something like that to my brother. But the damage was done. His confusion, the way he stumbled over his words, it planted a seed of doubt in my mind. I wasn't sure what to believe anymore. I didn't trust him, not after everything. But now there was this nagging thought in the back of my mind that maybe I'd uncovered something real. I don't even know what to believe anymore, I muttered. But I do know one thing. You still haven't apologized for any of it. For choosing Peter over me. For making me feel like I didn't matter. I'm sorry, he said quickly, almost too quickly. I'm sorry you feel that way. I hated that phrase. Sorry you feel that way. It wasn't an apology. It was just another way of deflecting responsibility. I let out a bitter laugh. That's not an apology, Dad. That's just you trying to avoid the truth. He tried to say something else, but I'd had enough. Look, I said, cutting him off. I don't know what's real anymore, and honestly, I don't care. The fact is you hurt me. You made your choice a long time ago, and it wasn't me. I want to make it right, Michael, he said, almost pleading now. I don't know how, but I want to. I didn't know what to say to that. I was still reeling from the thought that maybe, just maybe, my dad's connection to Peter was deeper than I'd ever realized. But even if that wasn't true, it didn't change the fact that my dad had failed me. I didn't need him in my life to remind me of all the ways he'd let me down. I need time to think, I said finally. I don't know if I can trust you. Not after everything. I'm not saying it's impossible, but don't expect anything soon. We ended the call not long after that, and I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Did I really believe my dad had cheated with his brother's wife? I wasn't sure. But his reaction had opened a door I wasn't ready to walk through. All I knew for sure was that things were even more complicated than I thought. Update. After that call with my dad, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, what I said wasn't completely off base. It started as me trying to hurt him, throwing out the accusation that Peter might actually be his son, not just my cousin, but the way he reacted, hesitant, confused. It was like he didn't know how to respond, and that got to me. I hadn't spoken to my dad in almost a decade, so maybe I didn't know everything about him anymore. Could there be some truth to what I said? I'm not in contact with my dad, and I don't go to family gatherings, so figuring this out wasn't going to be as simple as talking to people face to face. I started digging into memories instead, thinking back on things that hadn't crossed my mind in years. There were these late nights when my aunt, Peter's mom, would show up at our house. I must have been 8 or 9 years old at the time. She would always have some excuse, dropping something off, checking in on us. But it was odd how often she came by when my uncle wasn't around. At the time, I thought nothing of it. But now those late-night visits seemed suspicious. I remember my dad would act differently when she was there, like he was on edge. He'd send me to bed early or make sure I wasn't around while they talked. Sometimes I'd catch them whispering in the kitchen, but I never overheard anything. At the time, it all seemed so normal. Adults talking about adult things. But now I was starting to wonder what those conversations were really about. Piece by piece, the puzzle started coming together in my head. My dad's over-the-top favoritism towards Peter. The way he would always defend Peter, no matter what. And the fact that he never showed me the same kind of support. It wasn't just because Peter's family was struggling financially. Maybe it was because Peter was more than just his nephew. I started looking for anything that could give me a clearer picture. I dug through old family photos, trying to spot something, anything that could confirm my suspicion. I even reached out to a couple of old family friends, subtly asking about those years when my aunt used to come by the house. I didn't ask directly, of course. I didn't want to raise any red flags, but no one had any answers. Everything seemed to point back to the same place. I was on my own in figuring this out. The more I thought about it, the more it all added up. I remembered a time when my dad went out of his way to defend Peter, even when Peter was clearly in the wrong. We were teenagers, and Peter had gotten into some trouble at school. Nothing major, but enough that we both got punished. My dad's reaction was bizarre. He wasn't angry at Peter like I thought he would be. Instead, he kept telling me to go easy on him, to understand that Peter had a different kind of pressure on him. At the time, I thought he was just being protective, but now I see it in a whole new light. I didn't need a DNA test to confirm what I already knew deep down. Peter was my dad's son. It was the only explanation that made sense. The late-night visits, the way my dad treated him, the years of favoritism, it all pointed to the same truth. But now that I knew, I didn't know what to do with it. Should I confront my dad again? Should I tell my uncle the truth? The thought of telling my uncle made me sick to my stomach. He had no idea that the kid he raised as his son wasn't really his. I couldn't imagine how devastating that would be for him. My uncle isn't a bad guy. He worked hard, took care of his family, and loved Peter like his own. Telling him the truth would tear his world apart. And what about Peter? He didn't know either. As much as I resented him growing up, he didn't deserve to find out his whole life was built on a lie. He didn't ask for any of this. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that telling the truth wouldn't make things better for anyone. It would just cause more pain. For now, I've decided to keep it to myself. I don't know if that's the right choice, but it's the one I'm going with. Maybe one day I'll tell my uncle. Or maybe I'll take this secret to my grave. But right now, I don't see the point in blowing up everyone's life over something that happened years ago. My relationship with my dad is already broken, and knowing the truth isn't going to fix that. It's a heavy burden to carry, knowing that Peter is my dad's son and that no one else knows the truth. But what good would it do to tell them? My dad made his choices and I've made mine. Maybe keeping this secret is my way of taking control of a situation that was never really in my hands to begin with. I still don't know what to think about my dad. Part of me wonders if he even knows for sure that Peter is his son. Maybe he's been lying to himself all these years, or maybe he's just as clueless as everyone else. Either way, it doesn't change the fact that he failed me as a father. Whether or not Peter is his biological son, the way he treated me is something I can't forgive. For now, I'm at peace with keeping the truth to myself. It's not my job to fix the mess my dad created, and it's not my job to blow up my uncle's life. Maybe one day I'll decide differently, but today I'm choosing silence.